Introduction. Uh, this is a joint work with my advisor, Professor Shauliren from UC Riverside, and my long-term collaborator Professor Adam Weirman from Caltech. The topic of my presentation is exploiting a thermal side channel for power attacks in multi-tenant data centers. So you probably understood, guessed from the title that I'll be talking about data centers. So data centers are the physical home of the internet and it's the backbone of our digital economy. And there are a lot of mission critical services that are hosted in the data centers. And the data centers are growing really fast. But whenever we talk about data centers, the data centers that come to our mind is the mega scale Google type data center. But I'm not talking about this data center today. I'll be talking about a different kind of data centers, which are called multi-tenant data centers, also known as colocation. The multi-tenant data centers are a shared facility where tenants put their servers and the data center operator is responsible for the support systems like power system and the cooling system. And the multi-tenant data centers are actually everywhere. In the United States alone, there are more than 2,000 multi-tenant data centers. To put that number into perspective, Google has only 8 data centers in the United States. And in terms of market share, multi-tenant data centers were responsible for almost 40% of the total energy consumption of the data centers, which is 5 times that of the Google type data center. Now, who are actually using these multi-tenant data centers? Many large IT companies, they put their servers in these multi-tenant data centers to spread their network and complement their core data centers and bring their services closer to the user. Many medium-scale IT companies also use multi-tenant data center because they don't want to take on the responsibility of managing entire data center. And there are many IoT applications which have a lot of local generated data and be benefited from local processing also use multi-tenant data centers. So multi-tenant data centers are actually more common than we may realize. And securing the multi-tenant data center is very important. Let's first take a look at the multi-tenant data centers from a cyber physical point of view. The power to these multi-tenant data centers comes from the utility to this automatic transfer switch, which switches to the backup generator whenever there is an outage in the utility. And the automatic transfer switch also powers the uninterrupted power supply, which then connects to several PDUs. So in the multi-tenant data centers, this is the part the operator is responsible for. And the tenants, who can be Google, who can be Akamai, and many IoT applications, they bring in their own servers, physical servers, and connect to these PDUs. So from a security point of view, there has been actually a lot of work done to securing the servers or the data center in the cyberspace. So there has been work on how to secure the data center from DDoS attack, network intrusion, privacy protection, data breach, etc. But what about the physical security? If the power infrastructure goes down on the multi-tenant data center, or any kind of data center actually, the servers also goes down and the services goes down. And this can actually have catastrophic impact. For example, recently British Airways almost suffered a $100 million loss due to power outage in one of its data centers. Luckily, these kind of events are not very common, and data centers are generally considered very reliable with almost 100% availability. But we try to revisit this conventional wisdom, and we find that, in fact, multi-tenant data centers are vulnerable to well-timed power attacks, which can create or increase the outage risk for the data centers. So in this talk, I'll be going through these 4 questions. Why the multi-tenant data centers are vulnerable to power attacks? What are the potential impact of these power attacks? How an attacker actually will be able to do these power attacks? And finally, what could be the possible defense against these power attacks? Let's see, why are multi-tenant data centers vulnerable to power attacks? To answer this question, let's look back at the power infrastructure. The power infrastructure of the data centers are very expensive. It almost costs $10 to $25 to install a watt of capacity in the data center. And this could be this could take 60% of the total cost of ownership for a multi-tenant data center operator over a 10-year lifespan. So a natural way of maximizing this valuable resource is to do oversubscription. How actually this oversubscription works? Oversubscription is putting more server, or in our context, selling more capacity to the tenants than there actually is. This is actually very commonly done in other industries too, like in hotels or airlines who overbook. And also it is done in cloud services like Amazon Web Service, who also do this oversubscription. So what is the rationale behind this oversubscription? It seems like if you put more servers than the capacity allows, there could be some problems. The main rationale is that there are many tenants, and tenants have their peak at different times. So the aggregate level, the maximum power will be less than the sum of individual peak of the tenants. In addition, in multi-tenant data centers, there are some additional contractual restriction on the tenants that they cannot use their maximum power for a long time. Further, if there is still some oversubscription, due to oversubscription, there some overload happens, the infrastructure redundancy is supposed to take on the responsibility of handling that. So with all these, the 100%, almost 100% availability is ensured. But is it really the case? Let's take a look at this power trace of aggregate power for a 200 kilowatt capacity power infrastructure. And we can see there is no capacity overload. That means the power never goes beyond the capacity. But this is only true if the tenants behave normally. There are some times when the power goes really close to the capacity. And if there is a malicious tenant in the data center, it can actually increase its power at those moments and push the power above the capacity and create capacity overload. So this is essentially the new threat model that we study in our paper. So there is a malicious tenant in the data center who is trying to inject these malicious power loads at the times when it senses or it detects the other tenants have high power load as well. And it is doing this while still maintaining all its contractual restrictions. In our threat model, we do not consider cases where you can put some explosive device or some other stuff in your server and put it inside the data center and maybe remotely detonate, because that's orthogonal to our study, and if you do that, the tenant can be liable, criminally liable for that their activity. So we have seen the commonly used oversubscription actually creates power attack vulnerability for the multi-tenant data centers. Now, what are the possible impacts of this? So the immediate impact is, as we discussed, is the overload of the system capacity. And what the overload does to the data center is that it increases the outage probability. In our estimate, it increases the outage probability almost by 280 times of that without any overload. As a result, this power outage, which is supposed to be a very rare event, can become frequent. And we do some cost analysis of these power attacks on different types of data centers with different levels of redundancy. And on a 1 megawatt, 10,000 square feet data center, where there is 5% time of there is some overload. And we can see that for a tier 4 data center, without power attack, there is less than half an hour outage. But with power attacks, it can go almost to 7 hours. In addition, because now the additional investment done to increase the reliability of the data center is gone or is wasted, it also incurs some capital waste, capital investment waste. So in total, there could be multi-million-dollar loss due to this power attack. And this gives a big incentive to an attacker to launch these power attacks, who only need to spend a couple of $100,000 to get into the data center and with its own servers. And also, who can be these attackers? These attackers can be a competitor of the data center operator, which is trying to damage the business image of the data center operator and drive away potential customers. It can also target another tenant in the data center. They're bringing down the data center, also bring down the tenant. Or it can be any terrorizing organization disrupting important services in data centers and create chaos. So we've seen that the power attacks in data centers do have the potential of creating multi-million-dollar loss. Now the question is, how could an attacker mount a power attack? If you recall that The power attack is done by pushing the power beyond the capacity when the power consumption of the normal tenants are already close to the power capacity. But but if you look at the power trace, you realize that these opportunities are very intermittent, and these opportunities depends on the power consumption of other tenants, which the attacker doesn't know. It has no access to any power meter to know the power consumption of other tenants. So if an attacker is inside the data center, it can actually launch some random attacks at random times. But this will not be very effective. In addition, it can keep its power high all the time. But that is also prohibited by the contract. An attacker can be a little more smarter, and he can zoom into a smaller window and launch his attacks in those windows like a peak hour window. But still, the opportunity is smaller than the windows, and even though it may have a better result than completely random attack, but it's still very bad. So how an attacker in this data center could do this precise timing of these power attacks? To answer that question, let's revisit the multi-tenant data center again. So one of the key distinction of multi-tenant data center with the normal traditional Google type data center is that the tenants actually put their server in the same room and they share the facility. So even though they are completely separated in the cyberspace, they can be connected through physical processes, which can leak their power usage information to other tenants. And these other tenants, in our case, is the attacker. One such physical process is the heat generated by the server power, and the exhaust heat from a server can travel to another server and affect its temperature, which is a commonly known phenomenon in data center called heat recirculation. This forms a thermal side channel in the data center. The thermal side channel carries the power usage information of one tenant to the attacker. Let's see a demo of the heat recirculation. We've done this in Autodesk CFD. CFD is computational fluid dynamics. This is a physics-based simulation. So we create power spike in this circle rack, and we see how this power spike affect the other server. And we put two sensors to measure the temperature at two different points. So this is the power spike, and we see that the temperature changes in the other racks. And this is also verified by the graph on the right. So this is a demonstration of how the heat recirculation works. By the way, this is a simulation. It is 5 times speeded up because it actually takes a long time to travel. The heat travels from one server to another. So for an attacker, so we already know that if a server has high power, it is also generating high heat. So is it enough to just put some temperature sensor for the attacker and just see if there is a high temperature, launch and power attack? But this is not the case, because this data center suffers from what we call a near-far effect. So that a nearby server will have a more impact on the temperature sensor reading than a server that's far away. So if one is seeing a high temperature reading, it can be because of high power consumption only of the nearby servers, while the other servers have low power consumption and the total aggregate is actually low. And there is no attack opportunity. So let's take a closer look at the heat recirculation. We consider there are 3 servers, S1, S2, and S3. The T supply is the supply temperature coming from the AC. T in is the inlet air temperature of the server 1, and T out is the exhaust air temperature of server 1, and the exhaust air is sent back to the computer room air handler to be cooled again. So due to heat recirculation, the exhaust air or exhaust heat from server 1 comes back to S2 and S3 as well as its own inlet. Similarly, due to heat recirculation, heat from server S2 and S3 also goes into server 1. So if we put a temperature sensor in the inlet of server 1, what we will see is the supply temperature plus the impact from other tenants' power consumption. So we can see that the power consumption information of other tenants is actually embedded in the temperature reading in the temperature sensor. So let's generalize the observation model for the attacker. We can prepare the observation model by subtracting the supply temperature, which is known to the attacker, and its own impact, which is also known to the attacker, and come up with this simple equation where the observation model is the impact of the other tenants plus some measurement noise. And the matrix here, you call this heat transfer matrix, is it captures the coefficients, tells us what is the weight of the impact of a power server power to this temperature sensor. It also captures the effect that server heat takes time to travel from one server to another. So using this using this observation model, we propose to use a state-augmented Kalman filter, where we include a state transition model with a random process. Before I show you how this Kalman filter works, one important thing to notice here is that to use this Kalman filter, the attacker need to know this HB matrix. So to run this HB matrix, the attacker actually need to do some offline simulation or offline estimation of the heat recirculation process of the data center. And in our paper, we actually shown some technique to reduce the dimensionality of this matrix, which I'm not going into details in this talk. So with this Kalman filter approach, in our test, we've seen that the attacker actually can detect the power consumption, aggregate power consumption of other tenants with error or less than 3% error. So now the attacker has the knowledge of the other tenant's aggregate power. And with this, the attacker, we propose as attack strategy where it sets a threshold, and if it detects or estimates a power consumption above this threshold, it launches an attack. And we also add some constraint to this attack strategy that it doesn't attack for a long time. So you see these attacks are like, it doesn't keep attacking for a long time. And also we add some constraint that it doesn't do consecutive attacks. So there are some gaps in between these attacks. And the attacker is doing this using the thermal side channel information and also estimating the power usage using its observation model and the and the Kalman filter. Let's look at the timing accuracy or the statistic, how well this approach works. So we look at two different matrices, the true positive rate and the precision rate. The true positive tells us how many of the attack opportunities can be captured by this approach. And the precision rate tells us how many of the attack launched by the power attacker is ultimately successful. And we can see that if the attack time increases, then the true positive rate increases up to some point, and then it stays saturated while the precision rate goes down. This is as expected, because if you launch too many attacks, then many of your attacks will be actually unsuccessful. We choose a default setup of 10% of time attack, and we see that there are 54% time, the true positive rate of 54% with 53% precision. Just to compare, if the attacker didn't use this thermal side channel and it would launch these attacks randomly 10% of the time, it will have only 10% true positive rate. So we have seen that there are some vulnerabilities in the data center due to this power oversubscription and due to this physical collocation of the tenants inside the data center. There exists a thermal side channel which the attacker can use to launch power attacks. Now, what can be the defense against this? So let's quickly, briefly, I'll discuss some of the possible defense strategies. So first thing is how we can get rid of or make the side channel bad. So if you look at the observation model of the tenant, of the attacker, you see that the supply temperature is embedded in its observation model. So an data center operator, what it can do, it can randomize the supply temperature to randomize the observation model for the attacker. But the problem is an attacker actually can put a temperature sensor very close to the vents where there is very little heat recirculation effect and can detect this supply temperature change. In addition, in Kalman filter, the attacker can set the supply temperature as a state and try to estimate it along with the estimation of the power consumption of the other tenants. Another way of doing this is try to scramble the estimation of the attacker's heat recirculation matrix. To do so, the attacker, the data center can implement adaptive ventiles and can control the airflow, and using that, it will introduce more error to the estimation. But the problem with this adaptive ventile is that these are difficult to manage, and while you're managing it, you need to make sure that you don't create unintentionally hotspots. Finally, another And this is actually our favorite approach is to use heat containment. This is the most cheapest one, and it doesn't need any management. But the problem of heat containment in a multi-tenant data center is that you need a homogeneous server layout to actually implement this heat containment. But in multi-tenant data centers, people come in with their own server and own server racks, and homogeneous setup is very difficult to achieve. Other than attacking or handling this thermal side channel, another way of handling these power attacks can be trying to find the attacker before it even launches the attack. So intelligently monitor the power consumption of the tenants and try to see suspicious behavior. Like every time a tenant try to increase its power whenever there is already a high power of the other tenants. So we have seen that there could be many different defense strategies. In our paper, we actually focus more on the attack side, and I think a more comprehensive study on the defense could be a very interesting future work as well. So to summarize, the takeaway of this talk is that the commonly used oversubscription that we have seen that is done in the data center to increase the utilization of its expensive infrastructure can introduce vulnerability to power attacks in the data center. And unfortunately, there exist side channels that an attacker inside this multi-data center can utilize to launch its power attacks or time its power attacks. And we also seen that these power attacks could actually create multi-million-dollar losses. And there are some more unfortunate news is that this is not the only side channel. We've been following up this work, and we find more side channels, and hopefully maybe next year I'll be talking about come up with more bad news. Okay, so thank you everyone, and if you have any question.
Yeah, that's a really nice problem, first of all.
Thank you.
Are you assuming that each tenant will be assigned a dedicated rack?
Yes.
If so, then can we put sort of some sensor or measuring equipment to measure the power consumption profile for each rack as a function of time? And then you relate this to the lease time by these tenants, and you can tell whether this guy is using unusually high amount of power or not.
It's a nice observation. So the main thing of the threat model that we discuss is that the behavior of the attacker is not actually very different from the behavior of a normal tenant. Normal tenant is also supposed to be going to the maximum of its subscription capacity at different times. But the attacker, what it is doing is it is going to the maximum of this subscription capacity. It is not going beyond the subscription capacity. Yeah. So just looking at the amount of additional power, it's not enough, because this is also being consumed by other normal tenants. But the main difference is this attacker actually waits to do this and tries to time these spikes, or trying to time this power consumption that it goes to the maximum.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, I think the more interesting and difficult problem is if multiple tenants share the same rack or same servers through virtualization or whatever, that would be much more an interesting problem, though.
Actually, I understand this is actually an orthogonal problem to us. We consider a data center setup where you actually have your own servers inside the data center. The thing that you discussed, that the virtualization, there have been actually some interesting work done by Professor Heiming of Delaware. He's looking into how we actually can do these attacks from the virtual machine point of view. Like you are in the virtual machine, but for our case, you are in the data center with your own servers.
All right, thanks.
Hi, great stuff. So, can you give some rough estimation, like how much power consumption your attacker need to increase to mount an attack on a targeted time window? Like I want to mount an attack on this period, then how much power consumption I have to induce?
Okay, it's a very good question. So as I told you before, the first thing is the attacker only goes to its allowed subscription capacity. So it doesn't go beyond. So that's first thing. The second thing is in our setup. So it depends on also the power usage of other tenants and also the subscription level. So if you do not subscribe or your subscription level is very high, then the attacker may need only a little more power to make this overload. But if the subscription level is not that high, then attacker need to increase it a lot. In our experiment or in our results, our attacker was actually the size of 12.5% of the total data center, and it only need to increase its power by 15% to 20% to launch these attacks.
Thanks.
Hi, yeah, great talk. I was wondering if you've heard of the secretary problem or the best choice problem in dynamic programming?
Sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. No. So I think if you read that, the secretary problem or best choice problem, I think that's a great opportunity to improve the success of your attack, because in particular, you're putting this constraint of only attacking 10% of the times.
Yes.
So in the secretary problem, you have, like, let's say you have 10 times to attack, and it maximizes the chances that you're selecting the best option within that 10 times. So
yeah, I understand. Actually, this could be very interesting future work. We have this in our mind, but this is kind of our first work.
Yeah.
So we know that if you have you are talking about like limited budget, right? I have a budget amount of how much I can attack and how I allocate this budget to these attacks, right?
Well, not necessarily just maximizing. Like, you have several picks and you don't want to attack in all of them. But you want to find the right pick to attack. So that's a way to.
This would be very interesting.
The secretary problem would be nice. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So is it always the case that the capacity of the data center is fixed? So for example, I'm guessing that a real data center has some safety mechanism in place to shut down maybe the server that is controlled by the attacker at some point, right? To avoid, breaking down the whole system. Is it the case, or?
It's a very, very actually insightful question. So the difference is in multi-tenant data centers, because the operator doesn't own the servers. So actually, he cannot touch the servers.
Oh.
So even there is an overload, it's seeing overload. If you think of a Google data center, and if Google sees or Google data center operator sees there is some overload, he can do some manipulation of its server. He can slow it down or can turn off some servers. But that you cannot do in a multi-tenant data center, because the tenants are already within their contract limit. They are not doing anything wrong. So this is not something that you cannot apply in the multi-tenant data center. The thing the multi-tenant data center have to rely on is the redundancy of the system. And if the worst case scenario happens and there's some outage, actually there is some contractual obligation from the operator. They give you back some money or give some compensation if there is an outage.
Okay, thank you.
A little bit more. Actually, I'm on the job market next year, and my my field is cybersecurity, cyber physical system, computer architecture. I've been busy with some of this stuff. So if you are hiring, please consider me. Thank you very much.